The nonprofit TAT Foundation was created in 1973 to bring spiritual seekers and finders together. We publish books, videos, and a free online newsletter. We maintain a website of spiritual resources and hold 4 spiritual retreat weekends each year. Our goal is to offer practical guidance for following a spiritual path and living a spiritual life. For more information, go to tatfoundation.org. That's tatfoundation.org.
Our speaker tonight is Art Ticknor. Art and I have been friends for over 20 years. I knew Art before he woke up, and I've known him since he's been awake. Awake is better. Art was an early student of Richard Rose and has dedicated his life to the spiritual path ever since. And in 2004, after decades of intense spiritual effort, Art woke up on a solitary retreat, presumably for no particular reason. At one point in his search, Art came to complete hopelessness, that anything would ever happen for him. You know, after decades of putting everything he had into it, he thought that he realized and came to the conclusion that this was not going to happen for Art Ticknor. And after living with that hopelessness and despair for a while, he made a decision. And that decision was, well, if it's not going to happen for me, the least I can do is to work as hard as I can to help make it happen for someone else, maybe. And whether this commitment contributed to his final realization, no one can say, but Art stuck to it. He holds weekly group meetings in Pittsburgh, hosts retreats a couple times a year near his home in West Virginia, and is one of the main reasons that the TAT Foundation is as vibrant and active as it is today. He's also written a wonderful book, Solid Ground of Being, which I highly recommend. And sometimes he accepts offers to speak. We're very fortunate that this weekend is one of those times. Please welcome Art Ticknor.
I wasn't planning to do my best effort tonight, just sort of a middling effort, so.
Effortless effort.
Bart had mentioned Richard Rose's disposition toward effort, and I'm firmly in that camp too. And I also consider Richard Rose to be my primary teacher. He put up with a lot, but I put up with a lot too, so I don't know. When you were talking about that, it reminded me of something that I hadn't thought about for a while, and that's after the first solitary retreat I did, when I was back at work the next week, I had a Satori type experience. It was strange the way it kicked off because I didn't, I really enjoyed the solitary retreats. To me, it was about the only time my mind really relaxed, And but back at work, I thought, well, that's over. And then one night toward the end of that week, it was about, I think it was about 4:45, and I realized, oh my God, something strange is happening in my head. And I thought, I better put this off until people leave at 5 o'clock. And so I remember getting a 3-ring binder out of my desk drawer, and I swiveled my chair around so it wasn't facing the door, and put this binder on my knee as if I was doing something, and just waited for people to leave at 5 o'clock. And so when they did, unfortunately there weren't any late workers there, I guess, but so when they did, I just turned the lights off in my office and shut the door and just let it go. And the feeling I had was I'm going up, so I didn't lose body consciousness, so I knew I was sitting in my chair, but the feeling I had is I'm going up. And when that happened, there was like a snapshot. It was the best way I can describe it. I saw a view that I hadn't seen before, And the way my mind worked, and probably still works, is that it just immediately went into overdrive trying to pigeonhole this, get a description in words for itself of what I saw. And I think if I can remember what the title on it was Something Is. And what hit me was the awe that anything could exist, because my mind realized, well, if something exists, it had to come from something, and that something had to come from something. And initially, there had to be an initial something. Well, where would that initial something come, the initial thing, atom or whatever, where would that come from? So it was like my mind just saw a snapshot of the impossibility of manifestation. And then I felt like I was coming back down. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I know this isn't any final solution, but I apparently wasn't ready for it. I didn't kick myself or anything. I was just sort of amazed because I didn't know this kind of stuff even happened. And then, but after that, then I started going up again. And again, I got a snapshot. And there was lots and lots of mentation that went on this, like seemingly going up. The whole thing only lasted for about 45 minutes, I think. But the title that I put on that second view was Everything Is Just the Way It Is. And so the next time I went down I was living in Columbus at the time, the next time I went down to the farm and talked to Richard Rose, I got him to go for a walk with me or whatever, and I gave him all the gory details of this, great ramification. And when I got to this part about everything is just the way it is, he says, yes, but don't think that means there's nothing to be done. And I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe he would think I thought that way. My God, I would never think that. And damned if in my journal that I kept every day, the next year when I went into solitary retreat, I would read, my journal entries for the year prior to that. And word for word in my journal, I'd written, after my everything is just the way it is, and therefore nothing needs to be done. So one of the things, that I see now, I remember, where's Sean? He got here already, didn't he? So I remember Sean said a few years ago, or wrote something a few years ago about any seeker who doesn't keep a journal is a fool. Boy, I used to see that foolishness left and right. I'd cringe, just stuff, I was thinking that way 6 months ago. And then these things they were just completely the opposite of how I'd remember them. And so I've been going back through those journals I've got the wasting disease, I'm wasting time. I've been going back through those journals, trying to see if I can find if there's a pattern in here that might be, interesting to other, not the details, but just a pattern maybe of the way things unfolded. And so it's taken me an excruciating long period of time to go back and do that. But I keep coming across things where I think, my God, that's not the way I remember it. So I've been telling these stories about the way things were, and they're not at all like half the time, not at all like really happened. I hope they're an improvement on what really happened, stories. So anyways, there are three things that I picked out to talk with you about tonight. And to me, this isn't nearly as much fun as just sitting in a circle of chairs and being able to bump heads with people. But and I'm a dualist. I was born to annoy people, and yet I try my best not to do it. So I find that temptation creeping in here. But the three things, and so my short-term memory is sort of shot these days. So I wrote these notes. I put some notes together yesterday, and today when I was thinking, I know there were three things I want to talk about. What they were in there, the first one was. So when I looked at my notes, I made an acronym. Is that what we call it? Acronym. So it's NEO. Isn't that interesting? NEO, N-E-O. So the first one, the N, is the idea of no self. I'd like to talk about that a little bit, and then maybe get some crank with you guys a little bit about that. The second one is an E, and that's looking for what of you is eternal. And the third one is O, going on the offensive. So that's where some of the offensiveness may creep in if I don't watch myself. There was, Bart's mentioned this too, about like me and before and after. So with Rose, for all of us who knew Rose, there was a side of Rose that didn't manifest a lot in daily life, or at least when I was around, and that was a softer side. But it comes through in spades in his poetry. And if you haven't taken a look at it, the Carillon, the little book Carillon, which has Rose's poetry and also some just short excerpts, some other things he wrote and said. It's I remember with horror watching how the preliminary stages of that book being put together. He was sitting by the fireplace in the living room of the farmhouse one night, and he had boxes or, loose leaf books, maybe, I forget exactly. I think it was boxes, but he was going through poems he'd written over his whole lifetime. And the book is designed, the first section is poems he wrote before his enlightenment, and then, they're chronological anyway, I forget exactly where the break is, but when he was a college student, he said he used to light up a cigarette, not smoke, but just light up a cigarette and let it burn in an ashtray, and that cigarette smoke would induce a poetic mode for him. And so he wrote poetry when he was a young guy and kept doing it, as opposed to like Franklin Merrill Wolfe, who said he never had a poetic thought in his mind until after his realization, and all of a sudden he finds poetry coming out. But Rose was poetic. He had a poetic soul. He was very sympathetic. And he said even as a kid, he used to have to cross the street when he saw certain people walking down the sidewalk toward him because he knew he would lose energy to them. So he did definitely have that side of himself. And my very favorite of all the poems is A Part of Thee. And it starts off with this couplet. If I mess it up, I hope. It's, though you should seek me or still never know me, I am with thee. And the wording of that it sounds sort of odd, the wording of it, but I think it's very precise. So, though you should seek me or still never know me, capital M me, and to me, what that says, but I might just be throwing my interpretation on it, is that it doesn't make any difference if you haven't found me, capital M me. It doesn't make a difference whether you tell yourself you're seeking, tell yourself you're not seeking, or it's not even an issue for you. Nobody's soul is settled until they find what they are. And then the last part of that couplet, I am with thee, to me that, oh my God, that gets directly at the longing in here for I'm this separate something, that's been, I had the feeling like I made a wrong turn somewhere and got into the wrong dimension, I was like, geez, and to hear that. So to me, that strikes directly at the chord of longing, which I think is a key to any seeker. The more you're conscious of that, the more you remember that longing, the more the mind will go to work and do its job for you. Oh, and something else I was thinking about is at one of Rose's talks down here, and I think it might have been Chapel Hill, but I don't remember for sure if that's where it was. I heard him in the question and answer period, a woman asked him something about love, what is love, or something like that. And I expected, so I'd heard people talk about love in different public talks, where people get the question and answer, they get the microphone, and Rose would always just sort of brush them off. Sometimes it'd be something funny or whatever, but he wouldn't go into it at all. And because I get the feeling he thought they were trying to sell something, and he just didn't want to, play that game. But apparently this woman, he felt she really had an honest, serious question about what love is. And he said to her, love is the purpose of life, but we haven't got time to go into it now. Isn't that something? Yeah. So to me, this whole idea, the a part of thee, love is the purpose of life, it all gets at the question of self. And to me, self is inextricable from other. And so I think life could be summarized, and it's all about self and other. And self and other is all about love. One other related point is that a lot of us get to the point where we realize self is the problem, not knowing what we are. Or I remember getting to the point where I realized, well, the self is really what's in the way. If I could just get out of my way, things would be better. That became obvious to me at some point. And so the mind, which it works in opposites, that's the way the dimension we're in, the mind works with opposites. And so if you have a feeling that the self is the problem, just because of uncertainty and whatever the reason is that seems to be the problem, the mind then comes up with the solution of no self, right? So if self is the problem, no self may be the solution. And so that's one of the reasons I want to talk about that, but I want to put off that a second until I cover something else. So the something else is there's a country western song. I hate to admit I listen to country western songs, but I got in the habit when I was living in San Antonio years ago, and every once in a while I crank country western on the radio, and I heard a song. It turns out it's by the Zac Brown Band, whoever that is, and it's called Knee Deep. Have you heard that one? No country song listeners here? Okay. It's very philosophical. You guys are missing out. I hate to tell you this, but you know what the thing about what the country western song when it's played backward, what you hear? It's you get your truck back. You get right. Well, yeah. This one it ends with the refrain: "When you lose yourself, you find the key to paradise." And it begins with this comment or intention: "Going to put the world away for a minute." So isn't that something? So before getting into this anymore, I'd like to just do that. Let's just put the world away for a minute. Feel why you're here. I like the feeling in the room when I stop speaking, but I think maybe half of that's just because I've never liked to hear myself talk. That reminds me, I'd seen something on some TV program a couple of years ago where a guy who was a tremendous stutterer had found a solution. He was just an engineer of some kind. He wasn't an audiologist or whatever, but he found out that he created some kind of a little thing to stick in his ear, and it transformed how he heard himself talk. And with this in his ear, he talked very plainly without any problem at all. He took it out, and he stuttered so he could hardly, it was painful to listen to him. So back to the idea of self or no self. Being an etymologist at heart, I do like Bob Sergel. I always look in the dictionary to see, well, what does this thing really mean? So the word self I found described in my dictionary is a pronoun of the third person and reflexive, meaning pointing back at the subject. So naturally, any reference to third person, first person reminds me of Douglas Harding, who is another guy that Bart and I share as a teacher, and his greeting, which is my dear, dear friend. What a heartfelt, oh my God, yeah, my dear, dear friend. And to me, that was coming from the first person. And I don't have any great definition of how he distinguished first and third person, but one of the ways he described it is busted wide open for love. So when we're coming from the center, sort of busted wide open for love, the first person, everything is within us. And it's not confrontational. But most of the time, for myself, and I assume for a lot of us, we spend in third person viewing, which is I believe what we're trained into, And that's, we want the other person to be busted wide open with love for us. We want to be loved. And Harding also described that like the third person as being the symmetrical relationship. So I look at Luke and I think, no, here's a person. He's got a head, he's got a back of his head, stuff like that. And I'm just like what I see. I'm a person with, so it's symmetrical. I'm like what I see. But the symmetrical view is eccentric. It's not circling around from a center, but it's like spiraled around somewhere. It's not from the center. I see a lot of puzzled looks. And one of the things that I criticize Harding's teaching and Harding's students for is I believe that many of them think that the first person view is equivalent with awareness, being awake. And that and Harding's teaching was basically you keep practicing this and eventually it will become permanent. But he started practicing this 40 years before I believe he had his final realization. And when he updated his On Having No Head book after he was 77, which is the year he told me something that made me think that's when he had his final breakthrough, he wrote a whole section on the eightfold steps or something like that. And the last one was ego death. And I never heard him talking about that. I don't hear his students talking about it. So I think he must have figured, well, he didn't like psychological analysis and stuff like that. So he must have figured that would just be in the way. But so his experience was I kept doing this and it became permanent. And so I think that's the basis of his teaching. But to me, the first person view, where I'm busted wide open for love, or the third person view where I want you to be, that's just like one's leaning in this direction, one's leaning in this direction. And awakening is really triangulation, to use the term that Rose used, a triangulation above that set of opposites. So I've heard from several people lately about a website called Are we publishing this? No Self, I think it's hyphenated.com. And it says, it advertises it will, this exercise here will take you through a no self experience. And I would add, if they ask me to edit the site, I would say if you're properly suggestible. and to me, I shouldn't say too much because I know people are getting some value out of this, but I just can't help it, Augie. And not only you, but many people that I've talked to recently, yeah. So I know, and to me that also is sort of representational, or whatever the word is, of a lot of the Advaita Vedanta teaching is you get, so in other words, an experience still has an experiencer. And so if you experience no self, there's still a self experiencing it. The mind isn't constructed to have experience without an implied experiencer. And the honest position, I believe, is to say, yeah, I feel like I'm a self. I can't get any density reading on it. I don't know what color it is. I don't know how big or how small it is. But I sure as hell feel I got a self. But I think people lose track of that when they get, so like Jill Bolte Taylor, when she had the hemorrhage of the left hemisphere, and she wrote a great book about what she observed as all that was going on. And then she said when the visual cortex got flooded, she lost edge detection. And she said, I can no longer see where I stop and something else starts. So I become one with everything. And yet I don't think it occurred to her, well, but what's aware of that, So the view became such a wonderful, new and improved view that that's what got her attention. And so if the new view is beautiful, new and improved, it's going to be much more likely to trap us into it, I think. So my preference is always to provide annoyance rather than So in other words, what I'd say, you use the word absurd. So to me, the idea of no self is absurd. So I've got plenty of convincing evidence that I have a solid body self. I can't prove to myself or to anybody else whether this might be a dream. But if this is a dream, in the dream this is a very real body self. It's very convincing to me. Or it might be a holographic projection, because I know that the eyes don't see. So any picture that forms is somewhere, seemingly in my head. I don't know, maybe for some people they feel it's in their chest, but, the picture, the mind sees, not the eyes. So we don't know really what role the eyes play. Apparently they play some role, but it might be that the mind is projecting what the experience that seemingly hits the eyes and causes electrochemical reactions. But a picture appears. We know nothing directly about out here. This is like seemingly there's a sensory channel. This is like being in a black room in our mind, and there's a sensory channel with different kinds of meters sticking out from it that apparently pick up signals, but all this stuff gets processed in the computer. Somewhere there's a screen on the computer, and a picture appears, or a smell appears, or a feeling sensation appears. So in addition to the physical evidence that I have a body, there's also the even more overwhelming to me, overwhelmingly convincing evidence of having a mind self. So it's this feeling of I amness. So the idea of no self, to me, is absurd, and what I believe everybody is looking for, whether we know it or not, is to find the real self. Not to come to a conclusion, I don't got a self. Well, what don't got a self? Oh, I just saw something funny here. Page 2. Well, in the like to use the Ramana Maharshi terms, the jnani, the view of somebody who knows what they are or thinks they know what they are. If the person says, I don't have a self, then to me, I think, well, this person is goofy, or maybe they're using the term differently than I'm using it. But to me, a person who knows what they are could say, what I used to believe myself to be doesn't exist. But I don't think that's even a correct use of language, because exist comes from the Latin ex sistere, to stand outside of. And to me, that's exactly what this is. It's standing outside of the center of what I really am. So I wouldn't say this doesn't exist. So I think, honestly, you could say the self I used to believe myself to be isn't what I am. But you should be suspicious of anything anybody says. So point number 2 is looking for that of you which is eternal. So Sean isn't in the room yet. Can I tell this story? Oh, he is in the room? Where? No, that's good. Keep him out there. So years and years and years and years ago, back when we still had the TAT meetings in the wing of the farmhouse, there was a wing that the room addition on the farmhouse was roughly 14 by 16 feet, and we would have 50 people in there sometimes, and sometimes there'd be 70 people, and they couldn't all get in the room at one time. But so this was after Richard Rose was no longer communicating or whatever, able to communicate much. We still continued to have meetings in the farmhouse, but he wasn't there. And so we were struggling to do our best. And I can see where if a teacher didn't develop from a group, by one generation in, you'd be so far off base, you wouldn't, oh my God, But so anyway, I remember Sean saying at one of these directionless meetings, I found a new thread. So he'd been depressed, and he was happy. He'd found a new thread of inquiry to follow. And it was something along the lines of, I'm going to look for a part of me that's eternal, or a part of me that's, I forgot the exact wording, but you get the gist of it, And I remember saying to him, I'll say it was a question, but it probably wasn't. Well, wouldn't that just be more duality? And he's not in the room yet, is he? A week later, I got a letter from him in the mail, which is an anomaly. He was working up at Lindsley Outdoor Center, so he wasn't at the farm at the time. But before I opened the letter, when I opened the letter, I felt a wave of anger hit. Honest to God, I've never experienced that before or after. Just a wave of anger came out of the envelope, when I opened it up. And the letter was, you shouldn't be confronting people who've been depressed. And so in retrospect, I can see that he may very well have been on a great thread for finding his way home, you know. And I hope I've become a little bit more discerning about that kind of stuff, but I wouldn't vouch for it very much. Another story that I wanted to relate to you that sort of is somewhat related to this idea of looking for what is eternal, what of you is eternal, was one time in the TAT meetings when Rose was still functioning, in this little room that would be stocked full of people, you know, there was a table along one of the long walls, and so my job was to sit behind the table and take orders for food that Cece, Richard Rose's wife, would prepare sandwiches and turkey legs and soup and pies, fresh pies and stuff like that. And so I'd take the order and then I'd go out to the kitchen and get it and bring it back in for the people. And so one time I was coming back in, I remember I had a bowl of hot soup in my hand, and I started walking, the person was sitting at the round table, which was sort of like in the middle of the room or over toward the corner. And I was walking over crowded, you know, so I was elbowing my way over to the table, and somebody behind me said Art, or called my name or something, and then I heard Richard Rose. He said, "I'm right behind you." In other words, he was saying, "Be careful if you turn around not to bump your arm and bump your elbow and spill the soup." And then, without skipping a beat, which was like Rose, he added, but it was sotto voce, if that's the way you say it, you know. So basically, I was the only one who could hear it. So in a quiet voice, "I'm always right behind you." And in retrospect, that I could have hit the floor on hands and knees at that moment. I mean, it's like that. You have no idea how close it is, right, Bart? Yeah, it's you know, any little thing could hit you, but seemingly things have to be lined up. You can't do it yourself. There's no way you can really. You don't know all the variables to tweak to line up for yourself, but it doesn't have to be anything momentous, but any little thing, and that's something that stuck in my mind and kept working on the mind, but it didn't do the job at the time. But to me, that was pointing to, so I knew that what the first was Rose, just pragmatic, you know, be careful not to spill the soup, and the second one was coming from a deeper part that talked to a deeper part of me. And to me, that you know, that was the voice of the eternal talking to itself when he said that. So the third thing, I shouldn't admit all this stuff about myself. Okay, so this comes from Westerns, Western stories. I love the characters that Louis L'Amour and Max Brandon, people like that. They develop the best hero characters, and so the picture is, you know, you're living in one of these Wild West towns, or you're on a Wild West ranch, and there's a bunch of terrorists, you know, what do you call them? Criminals outlaws, outlaws, who are holed out somewhere, and they're terrorizing the town or trying to steal your ranch or whatever they're doing. And so almost all the time, these heroes, they come riding into town. You know, somebody writes them a letter that gets to them 6 months later, you know, and they come riding into town to save the town or save the ranchers. And what they inevitably end up doing is they take the fight to the terrorists. So the one solitary guy goes riding off into this whole hornet's nest to, you know, the bad guys, and it takes the fight to the bad guys. And so I was not exactly that kind of a spiritual seeker. And I can see that, you know, 99.999% of my time was just defensive. It was reaction and trying to please people and trying to understand my way to truth and all these nasty habits we get into. But my advice to you is go on the offensive. So here are a few silly examples I think about that go along with that. Well, and also the point that the terrorists in this case are really, they're not bad guys, they're well-intentioned idiots. So I'm talking about desires and fears, you know, they're well-intentioned idiots that are really there for keeping the organism functioning for whatever its function is, which apparently isn't enlightenment, you know. So instead of going with the flow. So every time I hear somebody say, I'm going with the flow, I just cringe, So go against the flow. Here's a quote from a guy, Admiral Jim Ellis. I have no idea who this is. I don't remember where I read this, but he said this was something his physics professor at the Naval Academy said, and he remembered, if you want traction, you must first have friction. And it's not that we lack friction, because when we look in here, we see there's a constant war going on. So there's always friction. It's just we turn our heads away from it. We don't want to see it, Or like for guys who only have 3 feelings, you don't want to feel it because you don't have any label for it anyway. So I remember one time I was upset with Bob Sergel and Mike Connors. I throw these names out. You may hear some of them or may not, but. Mike Connors and his brother were visiting, and I was lamenting to them some beef I had with Bob Sergel, and so Mike said, "Are you going out to the farm?" I said, "No, because I don't want to have to deal with that feeling yet." And he looked at me like I was an alien from another planet. He says, "You don't deal with feelings; you feel feelings." I thought, what a unique concept. So. Well, another way to go on the offensive would be, now this is one I want you to take seriously, if you're a vegetarian, eat meat. You know what vegetarian means? It's an Indian word that means poor hunter. That's Andy Rooney. Another thing that can be used and abused is prayer. So, and I recall, I adopt everything that I say is plagiarized. So I don't know where this came from, but I remember hearing somebody describe prayer as, "Please God, make 2 + 2 not equal 4." So and that's most of the forms of prayer I think that occur. So. But you can get more creative. So who was it? Alfred Polian, who Richard Rose had a correspondence with, said if you just shake your fist at God and curse him, he'll be so happy that you're admitting his existence, he'll roll over for you. So prayer can have many dimensions, And here's Teresa of Avila, who a lot of you are probably familiar with. Prayer and comfortable living are incompatible. So if you're praying and living comfortably, you may not be getting the most out of prayer that you could get out of it. Also, what I found in the dictionary, looking up Swami or looking up self, I had to go back to the back of the dictionary where they have whatever things where they show the roots of the words, and it turns out Swami, the Hindu word Swami, comes from the same root as the word self. It's in Hindu it's something like Sva, S-V-A-H, and the root for self, the Indo-European root or whatever, is S, and then a W in parentheses, whatever that means. I have no idea, and an E. It's like either S or Sva, I guess. So, and Swami means one's Lord and Master. And what better description is that for the real self than one's Lord and Master? So, and Rose used to say, if you pray deeply enough, you will hear and respond. Yeah. And then the final one under this, going on the offensive, is meditation. The root, MED, means to take appropriate measure. And we could with if there are 50 people in the room, we could come up with 51 different definitions of what meditation is or what it means to us. But meditare, the Latin word, means to think about or consider. And the synonym contemplate means to look at attentively and thoughtfully. And Richard Rose's definition of meditation was productive thinking. So he wasn't trying to put thinking on a pedestal, and his idea was that productive thinking would eventually stop thought, which many people recommend is the point you have to get to. I didn't find that personally. I found that thought could continue, and it continued on over in like in peripheral vision. It didn't affect looking, but basically the mind has to get to the point where it can look without interference. And so for many people, that maybe thought needs to stop. in the meditation paper, and then Rose goes into it more detail in the Psychology of the Observer, his recommendation for meditation is basically remember what you're looking for, and then use the procrastination technique that we're also adept at, but in your advantage, use it to turn your head away. So you remember what you're looking for, turn your head away, your inner head away from what's coming by, thoughts and feelings and things like that, if they don't seem relevant to what you're looking for. And by looking, I use seeing because that's sort of like my predominant sense. I could never pick up much by hearing. So like in college, I used to have to take notes, what the professor said, go home and read the notes. So I use looking, but so like Bob Ferguson uses listening attention. So, whatever sensory analogy makes, is closer to how your mentality works. But to me, you have to see the truth. And by see, I'm really talking about intuit. And intuition, so my feeling these days, I used to believe in this feeling versus thinking dichotomy, that people are basically either using feelings or using thinkings. But I don't think it doesn't make any difference which is primary or if they're balanced, because everything in the spiritual path, everything comes by intuition, which is a form of feeling, but it works on the intellectual side too. There's mathematical intuition as well as artistic intuition or whatever. Yeah, that's what I want to say about just too much of a summary of what Richard Rose's suggestion for meditation. What he'd say, if you're not addicted to something else. So he also realized that if people are very in a lot of turmoil, they aren't going to be able to do productive thinking, and they need to do something to get the mind relaxed or calm down a little bit. So something like breathing is watching your breaths, just counting your breaths, is a great way to reduce mental turmoil for a time so you can do some productive thinking. And to me, it occurred to me, I think I was trying to respond to somebody's inquiry a few months back. They were asking about meditation and things like that, and it occurred to me that meditation is very simple. There are 2 points. One is notice what you're seeing. And the other is the mind will do the rest of the work. All you have to do is notice what you're seeing. And I'd say that the most effective thing that you can do, and I didn't do this intentionally, but for me, this feeling of longing was always seemingly so close that when somebody says, well, what does nostalgia feel like? Or, what's the feeling of longing? Is it painful? To me, it was just, I was in so much misery and pain, but it always seemed close. But if you can feel it, like when you sit down to meditate, why are you doing it? Feel the reason why you're sitting down to meditate. Or just any time during the day, if, it'd be great if something like that pops into your mind, just what is my deep wanting? What's the deep wanting? Because when the mind feels that deep wanting, it's a problem-solving machine. It's going to go to work to solve the problem. And what comes up, the problem is that so many things are competing with that. So if you're hungry, then the primary problem on the mind is maybe finding some food to eat. But if you're looking for food to eat and somebody comes up and puts a gun on your head, the food to eat isn't going to be the primary problem anymore. So whatever the mind thinks is the most immediate problem, it's going to be working on solving. And so if you can carve some time out of it every day, and if you do it first, to me, doing it first thing in the morning sends a signal to the inner self. That the reason I did it first thing in the morning is because I couldn't control my schedule in the evening to do it. So I just found out the only practical time for me to have a regular meditation practice was in first thing in the morning. But I think that if you do that, it also sends a signal. This is the most important thing. I want to do this first, and the other stuff, it's all going to take a second priority. And so this noticing, to me, that's struggle. And Richard Rose was very adamant on, he thought every male needed to become a fighter. And of course, I shouldn't say this, but he thought every female should be a butterfly. But men and women may struggle differently, but basically the going within process is going to be a struggle, unless if you're 16 years old and like Ramana Maharshi apparently, and you get hit with enlightenment without ever having a philosophical thought. Well, yeah, so you send a thank you note, But if that hasn't happened, if you're over 16, and it hasn't happened, it's really a disposition. I wouldn't argue with anybody who says, I feel the very best thing to do is just to wait. I wouldn't argue with that, but my disposition was always, I better do something or things are going to get worse, So if your disposition is toward action, where you struggle is trying to be conscious of what you're seeing. And to me, so the difference between effort and effortless is that when you try to get a habit established, it's effortful. Once a habit gets established, you may see that it becomes effortless. So it's a feeling, or it's actually a view from the part of the mind you're looking at what's going on, whether it's effortful or effortless. And so to me, if anybody, a lot of people are really drawn to Mike Connor's idea about effortless meditation, which is basically a TM technique. And to me, if you're drawn toward it, be careful. So, but like in Mike Connor's case, it worked because he couldn't do it enough. He couldn't, So he's always upset that he wasn't really doing it effortlessly. So in that case, it worked great. But if you're looking for effortlessness, it's like Rose used to say, there's plenty of peace in the marble orchard. Have you ever heard that term? So I think that's basically as much torture as I have in mind for you. I'd like to finish this off. This is something that, one of the most profound things I think Rose wrote. And he didn't talk like this most of the time, in conversation, but in some of the things he wrote, this other more, I don't know what you call it, more guru philosophical side or whatever. So one of the things he did talk about, but not this particular kind of elaboration, was betweenness. And there are 2 chapters in the direct mind experience where he had notes on betweenness. To me, they're tremendously valuable material. And here's one of them that always struck me as the most beautiful description of it. How do we do it? We do it by carrying water on both shoulders, but by not allowing it to touch either shoulder. We stagger soberly between the blades of the gauntlet with recklessness and conviction. But we pick our way through the tulips with fear and trepidation, because the trap of the ladder is sweet. We charge the gates of heaven by urinating our way through hell, all the while sitting for 40 years on the banks of the Ganges, doing nothing. We sit on the banks of the Ganges not from laziness, but from an anger at laziness, a fury against our inner fury for wasted activity. And we pull back a terrible arrow, but never let it go. And by so holding, with the universe as our target, the universe is filled with terror at our threat. So I don't know how much time I'm on the schedule for. How's
12:30 midnight.
That's when confrontation starts, right? Yeah.
Okay. I'd love to open up for questions.
Okay, well, somebody keep track of time, and just shut it down when, so if anybody's got, I question, I got we just laughed when I was watching the streaming video this last year with Paul Hederman. After his talk, he says, I don't really like questions.
I think he said I hate seekers too.
He's allergic to secrets.
Allergic to secrets. But so questions, you're not going to ask an honest question. So how about rebuttals? Let's have some rebuttals. Rebuttals, yeah.
I was watching Closer Than Close
Yeah.
the other day, and I was stunned to see there's a close-up of your journal.
Oh, yeah. I remember Alex Levy did that.
And it's the part where you had the realization that art did not exist and hadn't
It never
existed.
been or something
I mean,
like that.
that's a taste, isn't it, of no self?
Well. Okay.
So I think too, you talked about thoughts. He said we don't have to stop thoughts. Thoughts can go on and decide.
For me,
And likewise, self could be the same thing. Instead of having to try and see through the self or kill the self, maybe you're saying, can be off to the side just as well. And this focus on no self is likewise possibly a tangent to the direction one could really go.
well, I don't see how you can inquire into no self. So no self is a concept. You've got a feeling of self. So I think that can be inquired into.
Yeah.
I'm not really saying that it might not be helpful. I'm just saying it's absurd. The idea of no self.
So is the idea of having no head.
Well, Harding even, he went through a period after 40 years. Yeah, that's right. After 40 years of teaching, developing these exercises and teaching people these exercises, he went through a period of 10 days where he felt he was over the edge, and I won't describe the rest of it, but he may have been lying to these people all the time. Maybe he was confused and stuff like that. So it's a paradigm. So the no head is a paradigm. It's not the truth, but the opposite, it's as true as the opposite. It's as true as having a head. So it's two different like sets of lenses we look at the universe and,
And how do you see that as different from self and no self?
Well, no self might, a productive use of that might be death. So I'm looking at life and death. And so some of these triangulations are going to be interim triangulations. The triangulation over some set of opposites won't take you all the way to the top of the pyramid. But if it's a big enough opposition, it might do it. So life and death would be a more likely one. That's something, so you don't know what death is, but I think it's more of a tangible kind of concept than no self. Well, what's no self? It's like, what, I'm going to be in a dark closet with no light and, no fingers to feel if I'm here, and, what's no self? The mind can't conceive of no self. So describe no self. So it's like the void. The mind can't conceive of a void. The mind can conceive of an empty space without any things, but an empty space has a connotation to it. So the mind can't conceive of infinity, that the walls are off at infinity in all directions. So the mind can't conceive of nothingness. So no self, I assume, would be something like nothingness, would it?
No, it could be like the doer, the non-doer. Things happening spontaneously. That we can start to get a hold of, that things are happening spontaneously, decisions are being made spontaneously versus me.
Yeah. So it's your neighbor. It's your neighbor saying that. It's not you saying that. It's your neighbor saying it.
It's being said, but is my current conception of self
Well,
the one
who's hearing it? What is it? Your neighbor hearing it? It's not yourself hearing it. Just in street parlance, like talking to a kid. Yeah, so I'm hearing it, right? I'm having that thought. I'm experiencing that. Well, to me, that's no different from having a body. I'm not saying I am this body. I'm saying I have a body, right?
Right.
And so the huge difference is between having a self and being a self or the self. So the concept of no self to me is ridiculous. Who's going to talk about no self?
Okay, but except art didn't exist. Art doesn't exist.
Well, that was inaccurate, I believe. It was so what I wouldn't say what I saw was inaccurate, but the mind's interpretation of it was. So art always existed. This body, this mind self. I mean, not always, but from you could, based on first person testimony from age preschool, whatever it was. When my brother took me to a Halloween party, at school before I was in school. That's the first clear memory I have. Yeah. So art existed from that time, based on my testimony. And art will de-exist, dematerialize at some point, and I'll be happy about that.
You talk about the experience you had once of seeing a decision, I think, play out. in your
Yeah,
mind.
yeah, slow motion, like a
Yeah.
car accident about to happen. Yeah.
You had a sense that it was the decision was being made.
Yeah, I saw the decision-making process running all by itself. Yeah. But I saw it, me, the undefined, whatever this me is. So yeah, so the idea of doership to me is completely different from no self. So at that point, I realized I'm not the doer. I don't have any strings to pull or any buttons to push or any, the mental self me. Mm-hmm. That.
Does that kind of like a habit is like a habit after a while you're not really making those decisions. It's like a habitual decision-making pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You step away from that.
Yeah, so that's, most of our life is sleepwalking, I think. And the strange thing is with the decision-making process, Bart had mentioned about this period I went through where I was hopeless. You know what triggered that? I wrote a letter to Rose after I got back from isolation, a solitary retreat, and he didn't respond to me. And so I figured, maybe it got lost in the mail. So I was back in the days of word processors, I had a digital form, and so I printed out the letter again and sent it to him, and I said, Mr. Rose, my letter must have gotten lost in the mail, and here's a copy of it, so I didn't hear back from him. And so when that occurred, I thought, he's lost hope in me, and if he's lost hope in me, it's hopeless. And that was, honest to God, that was the reaction. And so for 7 years, I indulged in self-pity. But what I saw, so the upside of that, which could have happened in 7 minutes, I don't know, it took 7 years, but so one of the upsides of it was I was doing so little I could barely get out of my chair, I remember sitting in the chair I only had one room in my house furnished at the time, it was a bedroom, computer room, reading room, everything. And there's a chair in there that faced one of the two windows in the room. And the window had an awning. It's an old-fashioned type house. It had an aluminum awning over it. And I noticed one day looking out the window, there was one of these wasp nests starting to build on there. And I thought, I ought to go out and knock that down. And then the next thing that hit my mind, this is what would hit my mind every time when any idea of doing something occurred, was, it's too much effort. And so I saw this grow bigger and bigger day by day. Yeah, but what I saw is there's a little window after you. So most of the time we unless we're at a street intersection, we can't decide whether to turn left or right. We're not even paying much attention to the decisions that are being made all the time. But when we're stopped like that with a decision, we see there was always that giving in to the decision. So even with a habit, if you happen to see it in slow motion, you might see that kind of thing occurs.
You're basically suggesting that as long as you're having an experience, there's a self experience.
Yeah.
That might not be art as you know art.
Right. Yeah, we put a label on it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But there's as long as there's experience, but there is a moment I will say that this is something that my dad would say a lot. And Kate would say a lot, and that's that moment of you're experiencing, but you're not aware of the experience, or you're not conscious.
Not consciously paying attention. Yeah.
Well, you're paying attention. You're aware. You're attentive. But it's
Something is recording all that stuff. It appears, even when we're not particularly conscious of it.
The best way I can say it is, David's brought this to light, and it's just basically that phrase. The best way I can describe it is the way I've heard it, and that's if you're watching a bird, you're watching the bird, you're experiencing. The minute you say, "Oh, what a beautiful bird," then you've gone back into your concept.
Well, the Zen idea of watching isn't hoeing corn, watching yourself hoeing corn. It's watching yourself watching.
Okay, so it's not actually just being lost in that experience.
Right.
The Zen coin is watching yourself being lost in the experience.
Well, you aren't lost in it if you're watching it. Watching yourself watching it. I mean, it's not a good way to say it, but so to me, the metaphor seems like it depends on. It's like if you're in an art museum and your nose is up against the wall, you aren't going to get a very clear view of the paintings or whatever the art is. But if you step back a few steps, then things get clearer. And it's like that. So what happened to me, the first time any of these things occurred to me is I was going to a confrontation session in Columbus, Ohio, after I first came across that group that had been formed after Rose gave a talk there before I met Rose. And the monitor of the group that night had asked me, or asked everybody maybe a question, what were you thinking about on the way into the meeting? And I remember my answer was, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was looking at the trees. It was spring. I was always in love with the leaves popping out on the trees and stuff like that. And when I stepped out of the meeting that night, out on the sidewalk, all of a sudden I realized, my God, I'm watching thoughts. I didn't even know it was possible. And so to me, that was the first time my mind took a step back in terms of being able to view more of the machinery of the mind. And that happened also with this seeing the decision-making process. Yeah, it was a discontinuity. I was stopped in my tracks. I was on the farm doing a solitary retreat. I walked down what I called a dirt road, and Richard Rose used to get upset. He says, it's not a dirt road, it's a gravel road. I'd been living in it, staying for a week in a trailer with no heat. It was raining most of the time. I was cold. It was in say November or early spring or sometime. I was cold, no heat, no food. I didn't want to take food along with me and be bothered, so I was just fasting the whole week. And so I was miserable. And one day the sun finally came out, so I said, I'm going out to take a walk and get warmed up a little bit. So I walked down this road, and at the bottom of the road there's a stream going across the road, which is the West Virginia way, So if you want to keep going, you go through the stream. So I stopped when I got down the stream and turned and came back up the hill. And when I did, there was another little runlet or whatever you call it, going down this property on the side of the road, and there was a big boulder on the edge of it, and the sun was hitting the boulder. I thought, man, I'm going out and sit on that boulder in the sun where I can really get warmed up. And then the next thought that hit my head was, I'd seen a no trespassing sign. I said, oh, there's going to be some hillbilly with a shotgun waiting behind one of these trees. And I was stopped in my tracks watching this conflict play out. Do I go? Don't I go? And it was just, to me, it was exactly like what's happened years ago when I was a bad driver. Now I'm just a unconscious driver. When an accident was about to occur, everything would slow down. The car would be sliding into the side of the bank or whatever, in slow motion. Everything, seemingly slowed down in great detail. So it was like that watching this. And to me, I wouldn't know where to press a button to make that happen. So accident, grace, whatever. But anyway, so to me, it's a question of what part of the mind we're observing from, which is sort of correlated with what we know about what we aren't, you might say.
And what part of the self we're experiencing from, I guess? I want to say parts.
What part of the mind self? Yeah. So we're really talking about experience within the mind, and you can from what happened with me, my interpretation of it, you can get right on the edge of the mind, and things from what seems like up there, you can get a perspective of basically everything that goes on in the mind. But it's still, you're still. To me, it's like a hypnotic attraction. You're still hypnotically attracted. The view is so enticing, or the drama is so enthralling, that you're still hypnotically attracted to the mind, what we really are. I can see I'm getting in deeper here.
I have a rebuttal.
Good. Wake me up.
All right. Now, it seems like you're not enthused about the idea of no self. Have I got that right?
I'm enthused about the
You're
idea
not
of
enthused
finding
about,
the real self.
Pardon?
I'm enthused about the idea of finding the real self.
Okay. Well, in my readings and studies, I've run across people who had some sort of experience of no self and felt it was beneficial or part of awakening or part of enlightenment. So does the fact that you haven't had that same experience mean that it's not helpful and beneficial for them?
Yeah, so that would be a misinterpretation on my part if I conclude that, which may very well be the case. It reminds me, Bernadette Roberts, when she had her preliminary, I think it was a preliminary experience, wasn't it? She said, when the self disappeared, God also disappeared. And to me, I never had any concept of an individual God, which apparently she did. So, yeah, so people may be talking about something completely outside of the realm of my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Coming back to it, it's like saying, you know, no self could be a cop out. Instead of copping out, you're saying go for the self.
Yeah.
Get through the clutter. But you know, it's not like the whole point of meditation and all this is not to go off in a cave and, you know, lose yourself, right? The point of living is to live. You know? You gotta know yourself.
The point of living is really to die.
Okay.
The purpose of living is to die.
Well, but that's going back to no self.
Well, you don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, then that's not, I mean, that's, whatever happens then, right? But, I mean, that's no self as far as I see it right now.
It may be. It may not be. So how did you get here this time?
You know, I think myself brought myself here. So I'm serious. I don't be kidding. Like, I don't think it was a conscious decision. I don't even know why I'm here.
You know, the idea of reincarnation, I think it's as likely as incarnation. So I don't think we can really dial into what's going to happen when we die.
Right, but that's still, you know, that's still all, to me, it's all speculation.
Yeah, but it provides a perspective for living. So what do we want to accomplish while we're alive? You know, why are we here? So if we don't know the answer,
but if you find yourself, like you said, that will guide it. That
oh yeah, definitely.
That will guide. So it's not up to us to say, well, you know, I'm going to die soon, so I better do this, or you know, I should do this.
So some people tend to get mileage out of the fear of death, for example. It was, to me, I thought, well, maybe it'll be a relief. You know, it wasn't a great motivator for me, but for some people, they get a lot of motivation. So anything that motivates us to keep searching, I think, is helpful.
Or to get anything that motivates you to live. You know, again, like that's what I'm trying to say. It's if fear of death makes you live, awesome.
I don't know, I'm just listening, and I'm like wondering if maybe like your idea of self is like there's two selves, like there's, you know, I mean, I don't know, like you're talking about like a disidentification with this self, this body self, right?
Yeah.
And so that actually you're talking more of a self that may be more like a no self, but isn't, but. So that really it's like not different, but it is different.
Yeah, and so one way you might describe that, but so the mind can't conceive of anything absolute or what an absolute condition is. But you could say this is a relative. I have this self, I have this self or this self.
Right.
But what I am, I know or don't know. Yeah. So what?
But you know that you're not this self because you can watch this self, you can see
Right.
this self, you can
Right.
know that this self.
It seems to be attached. Now, one of the final things that I had to address for myself was, well, maybe I am something that starts and stops because all I can testify to is consciousness. I don't know if I was here last night. I'd have to take your word for it if we were sleeping together. You know, I'd have to take somebody else's word for it. Somebody else is an object in my consciousness. How can I use them as the testimony for my existence, you know, or non-existence or whatever? So that's something that eventually you can pair things off up to about here, but then it gets hard to decide, well, whether would I still be what I believe myself to be, would I still be here if this were gone?
Now, when you, okay, I'm sorry. When you say this, you don't mean the head.
Yeah, the head. Uh-huh.
But you mean not the body
Connected
head.
to the body head, yeah. In other words, if the physical organism wasn't functioning, would I still be here? So do you exist beyond the limitations of the physical organism?
I'm pretty sure I do.
Well, see, I didn't know. I didn't have any data that convinced me.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Just kind of like what you said, about reason and intuition,
Mhm.
kind of like,
Well, intuition isn't foolproof. Intuition is just it's a refined feeling.
no, if you reason, use intellectual reason,
Mhm.
and then this kind of sense of self that's not this
So
self.
what's your reasoning combined with intuition that says you are something other than the
Well,
organism?
just, how does just the whole concept of perception, just this concept of my existence, myself, I am, how does that come about by chemicals in the brain, and just,
Well, you don't have an answer to it, right?
no, because it doesn't
So,
seem
so
logical.
basically your position
that-
is I don't know. So you can say I have a feeling, or I lean toward the side of hoping there's something of me beyond the organism, but I don't know.
Well, just reason says that, okay, what would place that in those chemicals? You know what I mean?
Reason, you can have a perfect logic machine, but if you start off with assumptions that are inaccurate, the logic means nothing. So you have to look at your assumptions. That's basically the whole path to self-realization is beliefs about what we are have to somehow get up into the view, and we have to be able to say, that's it, that's what I am, or no, that's not it. And most of these beliefs have been inculcated from the time we were 2 years old or something like that. We aren't even conscious of
Except
them.
for this belief, this, like that, I'm here, I'm freaking here,
What's here?
this thing. This
So
consciousness,
if
my
Augie
consciousness.
says that to you, what does that say? Here's a body that was born. It didn't say that when it was born. So if that was an innate part of it, it should have been able to say that when it was born. Here I am, folks.
But that's not.
Mama.
But I don't mean the body or the Augie.
Okay. Well,
You know-
you're welcome to your view, and it may be accurate. So you're the only one who can settle these questions for yourself. So nothing anybody else says is going to settle it for you. You can weigh evidence and try to sort out the BS from
Okay, but, all right. So,
So do you want me to agree with you?
no, I'm
No.
not explaining.
I agree.
Not your body, but your head?
Well, you
Is
use
that
your
what you
own.
said?
You use your own. So that was the process that I went through. So that in other words, I couldn't prove to myself that I was not dependent on consciousness, that I was not dependent on the organism for my existence. So the dog barks and says woof woof, and another dog says, "Oh, so you're alive, are you?" Words are just grunts and groans that have gradually come to have some agreed meaning. Not even that so much, but assumed agreed meaning. We don't know if we're talking about the same thing when we use words, right? So they're grunts and groans. They don't have any, they're nothing.
Right, that's, yeah.
We can complain better than most of the other animals. And to me, I think that's just, the self-consciousness, I think, but I don't know this for sure, is just the neural complexity has gotten to the point where so the way Bernadette Roberts described it in one of the early talks that I saw of hers was, it's like the mind's like a taco shell. And it's reflexive because when you're looking from this side of the mind, you see this side of the mind. When you're looking from this side of the mind, you see this side of the mind. And that's what self-consciousness is. There's a reflection process going on. So somebody says, Mary Beth, are you awake? Are you?
I haven't got a clue.
No, I'm not talking about some great philosophical thing. Are you awake? Are you here? Are you here, Mary Beth?
I'm here.
Yeah, so how do you know that the mind, if you watch what goes on, the mind does one of the Harding exercises. It looks back to see if I'm here. And I don't think dogs and cats have that ability, but maybe if they could talk, they'd
Tell us they do.
clue me in, yeah.
Questions? Two questions. I understand watching the watcher. How do I know that there's not another frame break? Watch the watcher. How do I know when I've reached it?
Yeah, all I can tell you is it's a different kind of knowing.
Okay.
And to me, the possible value of somebody standing up here and making a fool of themselves, saying, you know, I know what I am and stuff like that, is to inspire you to keep looking. That it's not an infinite spiral staircase that goes on forever.
Okay. The second question is, what is the relationship? And the only way I can put it is, you know, Art Ticknor, A, and will the real Art Ticknor please stand up? What's the relationship between the authentic? Are you understanding what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's an Art
Yeah.
Ticknor that was not awake.
Uh-huh.
And then there was an Art Ticknor that awoke.
See, I'd have to...
What is the relationship between those two?
Yeah.
And is there some sort of duality there?
Right. Well, see, the problem with trying to give you a reasonable answer to that is the mind can't conceive of a non-thing. So the real me is not a thing. It's not an Art Ticknor or an Art Ticknor replacement. So the mealry, misfire, the real me is, it's what you'll find you are at the core of your being also. It's my conviction, although you'd have to find out if that's true or not.
One last thing, and Bart was talking about earlier, and maybe I missed it. I didn't hear what part, or if there was a surrender.
Oh, yeah.
And if you could expand upon that a little bit.
Well, to me, surrender is bowing to the truth of what you see. And so the whole path is basically one of surrender, it's like you got a big glass of stuff to gulp, and you can't swallow it all in one gulp, and you should take gulps or sips or whatever. It takes a while to get the whole glass down. And so every time you take a gulp or a sip, there's a surrender involved. So you're seeing through a faulty belief you had about yourself, and that's replaced by something. And the final belief that bites the dust is going to be a final surrender. For some people, it seems to be very traumatic. For me, it wasn't. And I expect that's because, first of all, I was around Richard Rose, Douglas Harding, people that I believe had made the trip, and they could wise us up a little bit, And the other was just the decades of erosion of the ego. So I think for a young person with a big ego, like Richard Rose said, he had the biggest ego in the world. After my son was born, our first child, maybe he was a couple months old, and one day all of a sudden something clicked in my head, and I realized here is a creature I would like to see ahead of myself in the trough for life's goodies. I remember the exact words that formed in my mind. And what happened is I fell in love with something other than myself. And so when that happens, it's a surrender, So so the flip side of the coin I saw at that time was I've been the most selfish person, at least in the United States, before that, which isn't accurate, but it's just you don't see things until you see the contrast. Mm-hmm. So every one of those is a surrender, and the final surrender is going to be. So I hear people saying, "Oh, I don't know if I can give up this or that." We don't give up anything. This stuff it's like there's a big hand that's, but seemingly most of the time it's not doing it until we're sort of asking for it or sort of ready for it. I guess I don't know. That's in my life anyway. Yeah.
There's a psychological approximation of no self, which is the concept of flow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I learned about this decades ago when I was a counselor, and I would go in at 10 o'clock and leave at 8. And during that time, presumably, I was seeing clients, I was working with them, charts were being filled out, I was getting cups of tea, going to the bathroom, getting something to eat. It was kind of cool because it was effortless.
And it's wonderful when that happens, isn't it?
Yeah. I would leave at 8 o'clock full of energy.
Yeah.
And fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great material for the database, for the mind to be able to chew on. Mm-hmm.
But that was when I still thought that the self was real. And you have to put yourself in the situation of just enough and not too much challenge to create that.
Yeah.
But when the self is seen as an illusion, the personality is seen as an artifact, not real in and of itself.
You can actually see through the personality as not being you before the final shoe to drop is individuality. So you can pair off all the personal characteristics. So it's like, who was it, one of the Indian big guns, Ramana or Nisargadatta, was challenging somebody, oh, you think you're a person? Where does that idea come from? You know, so personality is superficial compared to individuality.
I'm not sure I see much difference. Because if personality is seen as an artifact, then the idea of I drops.
The only way that can happen is if you are outside the mind.
Well, yeah.
So the mind can't conceive of a non-thing. Yeah.
That's the point. You are outside.
Well, Bart, I think, was saying something about that. It's one thing to hear it, but and Bernadette Roberts said the same thing when she was 19, 18, whatever, going into she tried to get early into the Discalced Carmelites, and her parents made her wait until she graduated from high school. She had a Carmelite priest who was like I forget what they call it, a preceptor or mentor or something like that. And he said something to her one day, you know, there's a big, someday you're going to be by yourself, alone. You're going to be all alone, and you're going to have to, you'll be on your own. You'll have to do things on your own or something like that. And she said, I know I'm already nothing. She was a smarty, you know, she was advanced for a kid. And he said, yes, but there's a big difference between knowing that you're nothing and being nothing. And so it's the same. So the mind can grasp onto the concept of no self, or whatever, however you want to describe it, you know, the concept of I'm not a separate something, I'm not individual, I'm not a person, but there's a step from there to actually knowing what you are. It's a different kind of knowing, and you'll recognize it's not, so like who Meryl Wolf said, there's perceptual knowing, like there's a tree, there's that, and then conceptual knowing, oh, that's a tree, and then there's this other kind of knowing that.
Maybe some people have to know what they're not before they can find out what they are.
Well, I assume that happens, yes. That either it happens over a long period of time, or there'll be like possibly what happened with Ramana Maharshi, although I question whether that's an accurate rendition, but that it'll all drop, within a short period of time. So surrendering is surrendering to the truth. Well, you have to see the truth before you can surrender to it. And there'll be a final opposition if it's like what happened with me, where you'll see there's this, and then there's this, and they don't. So what I'm looking at and what I believe there's a contradiction here somewhere. One of them has to be wrong. And if the mind keeps staring at that opposition, something has to give.
So I see there's a experiential sense of self.
Yeah,
Your
yeah,
body,
right.
you're having experience, you got yourself here. There's a mentally created sense of self, which is your social individuality. You think well of yourself or your problems or whatever. And so beyond that, you could say that like a consciousness self, or an awareness self which is in itself, has no characteristics, it's formless, but yet is something. Something like that? Am I, in other words...
You were going okay until the
last part?
Till the last part, yeah.
So let's go up with the hierarchy of selves. We've got the experiential self, we've got the mental self.
Well, let's just say experiential self or selves. There might be a whole gamut of them. Right? We can slice it and dice in different ways, but there's the implied self of experience. There's the self that we see, and then there's the self that we feel that we can't see, we can't touch, we can't calibrate anything about. The I amness. I am, yes, I'm here, I'm awake.
You're not talking about the problematic sense of self there, like...
Well, to me that is, Nisargadatta called it the sting of the scorpion, self-consciousness.
Right.
When you become 5 years old or whatever, and all of a sudden now you can't play without worrying about what the neighbors are thinking.
I'm such a problem for myself.
Yeah.
A burden or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, so would be the mental...
So let's say that whole
you wanna say
range
that?
is experience within the mind's experiential self. Yeah.
All right. So, but you don't want to go beyond that to say, or you don't
Well,
You don't, you wouldn't frame it the way I framed it, that there's,
no, I wouldn't frame it the way you framed it, but
That
I would
there's-
encourage you to go there.
that there's say, beyond the mental and the physical.
Beyond the
there's-
mind is how
Is
I describe
an
it.
awareness self or a consciousness, something like that.
Well, yeah.
How would you
What
characterize
you
it?
really, the way I describe it is what you really are, may be beyond the experiential world.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And
But
I-
it would be on the experiential world.
Yeah.
But the question, I mean, I think the problem of no self is that people, the mind characterizes that as nothing.
Yeah, and the mind can't conceive of nothing, so it's an artificial, it's just like putting off the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But there still seems to be some selfhood with that. I mean, there seems to be something there, right? I mean, there's a, I don't want to say it's, let's call it higher individuality.
Yeah.
Okay, so we, beyond the mind and beyond that, we could call a higher individuality.
No, I'd say no.
All right.
Yeah, I'd say it's completely non-individual, which is the big distinction. So in other words, a phrase
Okay.
that came into my mind about it is, it's like a lighthouse without anybody in it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
But that's goofy, I mean, but.
No, I like it. Because light, I like light.
Yeah, and the same with, somebody describing it as lightness, and somebody else describes it as dazzling darkness and whatever. That's all filtering back into the mind. The mind's grasping. So to me, it's like there's an open channel between the conscious, between the organism and its source. And that channel has been closed, obscured, whatever the case is before that. And when that channel opens, it's like a huge download. We were talking about this a little earlier. There's a huge download being piped into the mind. The mind doesn't catch an iota of it, So it's coming up with this dumbed down version of what I, really am.
Like, let's take, for example, Richard Rose. We'll
Yeah.
say he's self-realized,
Yeah.
okay? And so he's that universal awareness, you want to say? He's realized his identity with that?
No, I wouldn't say Richard Rose is or was. I would say what you are may be that. And
All right.
everything is there and nothing is there. And so
Got it. Okay.
do that computation.
All right. But I want to say Richard Rose is there.
Well, Richard Rose was in that. So,
Okay, in that as what?
well, just like you're in it.
Oh, okay, so there's a context, a universal context that he's within, something like that? Or,
Well, no, Richard Rose and 6 billion, more than that, I don't know how many have ever existed, but all the people on Earth that have existed and the ones that will exist in the future, they're all in the self, or were in the self, depending on how you want to count.
Here's a question that might, I don't know what it's gonna do. Anyway.
I'm worried too.
Here's a question. So, I hear this this dualistic talk about the self, like there's art, there's some little self, and then there's
These people made me do it. I wouldn't have done it otherwise.
I'm just not gonna go through it. Okay. And then there's the conscious self, that's aware of all the surroundings. Okay. And then there's the universal self. All right. Woo!
So what's your point?
So if you get to the universal self and you get that glimpse of that, that download that you were talking about, or you've got some experience of.
So you're talking to Art Ticknor now?
No. I'm talking to everybody.
Okay. Well, here, come on up.
No. It's just at that point when you have that experience.
It's not an experience.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So I disagree with your argument because I disagree with your assumptions. Is that how Rose used to say?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I think we're getting too far off.
well, no, I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to try to bring it back. Seriously, though, if there is that, awareness, then is there any problem being art? There's no problem being art.
Not as long as Art's not concerned about being hit by run over by a bus or something like that. Yeah. So has a programming that's running. And so art has likes and dislikes. Art has anger and happiness and things like that. It doesn't wipe the slate clean for art, but it takes a hell of a big load off art's back. I'll tell you that.
So, I mean, you know, that, doesn't that kind of blend that whole thing a little bit? Blur the lines a little bit?
No, the lines are very distinct.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. So, when discussion about paradigms, hierarchies, things of that nature, would that be something seen to grasp in a literature or solo art group? So with those things in mind, can that ever be expressed in a realization, prior to realization without having a realization?
Well, yeah, I think like the process of, what was the first thing you mentioned about the oppositions or triangulation, or what was the?
Right.
That is something you can witness going on. There's a lot you can witness going on before a final realization, yeah.
And then I was wondering if the group work is very important, which is the retreat we're at, but let's say we leave the retreat.
Yeah.
And then it's solo life work, right? So
Yeah.
in that context, it's really society would be the group.
Yeah,
As far as that life generating work,
Yeah.
which is, I guess, what
Yeah, people,
preceded would
what
be
I think we
spiritual action.
were talking about earlier, people are the problem. You know, people are also the solution in a way, because they're what cause a lot of the consternation that keeps us alert. So if it weren't for that,
That's what makes us awake.
that's what makes us wiggle. Yeah, fears and desires. So to me, fears are saying to the organism, go away from that. You know, it may be harmful. Desires are saying that's something that's for your benefit. Go chase that. You know. And so that irritation of fears and desires, and then all the ones that are triggered by other people.
And you're saying, and I like what you said, because you said that, I mean, it took so many years to be on the offensive, so it's almost a swallowing right then and there, be here now,
Yeah.
learn from that mistake, from myself, others, or whoever, and that would be that triangulation again.
Yeah, you'll see it because there'll be you'll notice there's a big feeling difference. So like when the initial triangulation, which might be when you get out of the swamp of being identified with what you're feeling, it's such a relief when you realize, well, I'm still going to be depressed sometimes, I'm still going to be anxious sometimes, whatever the feelings are, you know, I'm still going to be conflicted. The mind is always going to be conflicted. So
Right, and that's what, and then there's the ultimate subtleness of it, because this is the mind trying to express itself. Right? So
it's all going to be okay. Yeah, you wouldn't want it any other way. Like when you know. So that the mind is doing its thing, it's doing a good job of it, but it's just not. It seemingly isn't designed to solve the big problem. That, like Rose used to say, that there's an opening for it, but it's not the primary programming of the mind to solve that big problem. So he expressed it as the Absolute got tired of pulling all the strings, so it designed the robots to do some reaction on their own. You know.
I thought I already said that.
Yeah.
Would you say consciousness is an experience? Or do you say that consciousness isn't an experience?
Well, I'd say consciousness depends on a thing, and a thing depends on an experiencer.
Okay,
So
so
it's
consciousness is not an experience.
It's experience and experiencer. It's not a single thing, it's a split thing.
So you're saying experience requires two?
Yeah.
Okay. That, okay.
Second one.
I have a simple question. How does the mind come to be?
The funny thing is,
Because as to me, like human intellect understands that with it seems to me the mind creates the ego, the I concept. The I is a concept the mind holds on, and we totally believe in that. So how does the mind come to be?
well, one of the clues about that is the fact that these people here, there's a commonality of agreement on many things. And so to me, that's great evidence that there's a projection that's coming into 6 billion human beings from the same source.
Projection.
Like a TV program that's being projected. And it's there's 6 billion programs being projected simultaneously. So when you say the mind, you're talking about what you believe to be an individual mind? My mind?
No.
How does my mind?
The
The mind. Well, what is the mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. You meant it's like as if there's like TV programs, like it's broadcasted, then whoever has a TV can tune into it. Is that like that?
So you're saying like the mind is like the TV set?
No.
What are you saying?
That's my question. How does the mind come to being? Like then so many individual cells.
Why is that relevant to you? Why is that important?
Because as to me, all the illusions are linked to the mind, and because it's so difficult to jump out of the mind, and I feel we are controlled by the mind. So how does that come to being? It definitely,
suppose I could give you an answer that you thought was authoritative. What would you do with that?
Yeah, I feel instinctively that the mind should be a tool of I am. But at the moment, before we are awake, we are the slave of the mind.
Well, what you believe yourself to be is identified with the manifestation of the mind that you experience, that your organism experiences. And so the mind is constructed as a problem-solving computer, a set of programs.
Right.
And
it's
trying to solve whatever problem seems to be the most threatening, you could say.
It should be a good tool, right?
It is, that's what it is.
So why the tools are using us?
What's this us? Well, what's this us that's being used?
Why are we so willingly to be used by the mind?
You are the manifestation of the mind as it continues to project out into visible cosmos. So what you are, when you say me, all you're talking about is Mary Beth, an organism, a humanoid.
I'm meaning the concept of me, yeah.
Yeah, so when you say the mind is using me, no, you are, as far as you know, you are what you experience. Plus this experiencer that is so elusive, the I amness that you can't see, and every time you turn around and look, it's behind you before you can see it. So your question about where the mind comes from, you might get an answer to that when you know what you are. You might not. I have no interest in that, but so a lot of the people I work with in Pittsburgh are Indians, graduate students, ultra smart people, way smarter than I am. So I have to find a way to annoy them, on my terms. And so for the Indian psychology seems to be very interested in metaphysics, which I'm not. And so, but to me, I think if I were interested, I could find some answers, but I'm not, and it wasn't relevant to finding, to selling my soul. So I would say that question is a red herring for you. In other words, if you had an answer, it wouldn't do anything for you. So the tools at work are the mind. All you can do is watch the mind at work. I shouldn't tell you that, should I?
What's the mind? I get lost there. I can't catch it. That's it.
Yeah, so my recommendation for someone who wants to wake up is try to notice, in other words, become conscious of mental activity, what's going on, as opposed to sleepwalking. Yeah. And that's a struggle, and in a way it's absurd, but so there's seemingly the way the mind's constructed, there's an ability to be semi-awake, and that ability is connected with being able to use procrastination rather than having it used on the mind. You said it's still the mind reaction, but when you can turn your head away from what's not relevant to, so it's like when you're studying, you got a test and you got to study, and the thought pops into your head, oh man, I'd really like a pizza or something like that. And so your reaction would either be to close the books, go out and get a pizza or the pizza delivery or whatever, and think about, oh man, it's going to be so good, you know. Or the mind can say, yes, that's important, but I can do that later. Right now, what's important is to get this, starting with the test done or get the paper done or whatever. So it's that ability to turn the head, the internal head, away from what's not relevant to what you want to focus on. But that's semi-awake. That's as awake as you're going to be within the mind.
Within the mind.
It's as awake as you're going to be within the mind, yeah. And when these jumps happen in the mind, like when you triangulate over, when you are no longer identified with what you're feeling, you can still feel tremendous good and bad feelings, but you won't be lost in that swamp.
Right.
So each one of those is a little sign.
You won't become the feeling yourself.
You don't become it, right? Yeah. You so watch it from a little distance. You feel it. You don't try to repress it. It just makes it all messy and worse, you know. Which I can testify to.
Yeah. The last sentence of Rose's poem that you read was so amazing, and it's maybe a little bit different than what we're talking about right now, but this I got an immediate physical sense in my heart.
Me too, yeah.
Oh my, it's so great.
Yeah.
And he just if you want to talk about that at all, or if not, it's okay. But I just wanted to say, amazing. And that the vision I got of a point, and then this like this big thing, and this point, then it went like that in there. So beautiful.
Yeah, that's how it strikes me too. Beautiful. I don't have any articulateness about it, but just how could anything be said any better?
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Could you say more about when you're talking about focus maybe every day on your longing, because then the mind will start to solve the problem? It surprised me when you said that.
Yeah. So to me, the mind is always working to solve whatever seems to be the most pressing problem. And usually the most pressing problem is changing every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that. You know, it's like Steve Jobs. Right? Somebody told me today died, which I hadn't heard.
Yeah.
He said, I think it was in that Stanford talk where he said to focus on something, it's not picking out one thing to focus on. It's not getting caught up in the 99 other things that are even important. Yeah, so to me, the mind is always focused on whatever it feels is most important, and it's going to be driven by exigencies. So I got to get up and go to work. If I don't go to work, I won't be able to buy food, or I've got to brush my teeth, or whatever it has to be is right there. And there's always distractions, and some of them are necessary, but they're distractions to the real problem, the longing that we feel.
I guess what I was surprised, maybe I'm thinking of the word mind differently, because your mind maybe has a direct connection to something. I think of it as kind of ego mind and monkey mind, and so it's easy for me to feel my longing. So quite frankly, for me to do that every day, to be willing to go into that place where I will cry, it will be deep, I will be hurt, to be open to that longing because I feel it so deeply. It's hard for me to think about how my mind, my thoughts, that doesn't seem like it has a direct line to God, so to speak.
That is God speaking.
The longing
is the transmission coming from the real self down into the organism. That is God speaking. And so when we feel it, what we're doing is we're recognizing God. And so if prayer, to me, the very most effective form of prayer would have to be feeling that feeling of longing. Because the feeling says, it's like the Rumi poem, I found myself drunk in this tavern. I don't know how I got here. Whoever brought me here is going to have to take me home. And so that recognizes the fact that, something brought me here. We call it something, we can't consider it isn't something. Yeah, so according to Jill Bolte Taylor, and I don't have any reason not to believe her, she said any feeling washes out of the blood, the hormones that are connected with feeling, they wash out of the bloodstream at a max of 90 seconds. So if you're feeling that feeling for longer than 90 seconds, what you're doing is you're going into an emotional spasm where the story of yourself, you know, on the left side of the brain, the way she describes it, that picks up that feeling and starts elaborating on the story, how this feeling fits into the story of what a wonderful person I am, what a terrible person I am, you know, what the neighbors did, what the kids said. But so to me, feeling it was always very close to the surface. I didn't have to sit with the feeling. All I had to do is just, you could say, just remember it. I knew where to stick the thermometer and to find the temperature. And then that reminds the mind, oh yeah, there are things you got to do when you get dressed and go to work, and there are things you got. But right now, what's important to me is answering this call.
We're a little bit over, so
Okay.
it might be a good place to stop and get another shot at him Sunday afternoon.
Thank you.